Hello friends, this is Grief speaking. I've got a weird one for you today. I recently fell down the rabbit hole of magic tricks and stunts gone horribly wrong and decided that it would make for an interesting iceberg. I was surprised when I couldn't find any iceberg charts on this topic, and so once again, I made my own. 5 tiers descending from least to most obscure. Just to be clear, these are incidents involving magic or magic adjacent stunts. I was originally going to do just magic tricks, but there were too many interesting and horrifying stories involving things like knife throwing or underwater escape attempts, and I feel like these kind of stunts fit right in with a magic act. So while a lot of these aren't magic, they're all things you might see at a magic show. Anyway, that's enough hedging. I think this is a fascinating subject, so let's get right into the iceberg. This is the Magic Show Incident Iceberg explained. So let's get right into Tier 1. Starting with Polish magician's nail fail. This one circulated pretty heavily in 2016 when a Polish TV host was injured live on television due to a dangerous trick. A magician, Marcin Poliniewicz, was performing his act on the Polish morning show Question for Breakfast. The trick is somewhat familiar if you're a fan of magic. Basically, the magician places several paper bags on the table, one of which has a large nail in it. He shuffles them, and then one by one he smashes the bags at the risk of piercing his hand. In this version, he does something fairly unorthodox and some would argue immoral by having one of the show's hosts participate. The magician smashes the first bag himself before grabbing the host's hand and slamming it down full force. As you might have guessed, he messed up and the nail stabs the woman in the hand.
Uważaj.
Raz, dwa.
The magician and co-host are laughing at first, assuming she's just goofing around, but then you can see the shock on the magician's face when he realizes what's actually happened. They awkwardly stand there for a minute while the woman is in clear pain and finally walk off the set. Apparently, the nail didn't get very deep into her hand, and she surprisingly didn't even need stitches. Siegfried and Roy Tiger Incident. Probably one of the most famous incidents in magic is when Roy of the famous magic duo was attacked by their white tiger. During a performance in 2003, Roy held his microphone up to the tiger's mouth, telling him to say hello. The tiger responded by biting Roy's sleeve. Roy attempted to retreat from the tiger when it leapt at him, knocking him to the ground and then biting into his neck, attempting to drag him toward the tiger's cage. While Roy survived the attack, he did sever his spine and suffered major blood loss that left him permanently impaired. One of the most interesting tidbits about this incident is that Roy actually suffered a stroke during the performance, and while most people assume that it was because of the attack, Roy himself actually claimed that the stroke occurred before and that the tiger had somehow sensed it and was attempting to save him. Pretty wild stuff. Amazing Joe crushed in a coffin. In 1990 on Halloween night, magician Joe Burris, aka the Amazing Joe, attempted a classic Houdini-style coffin escape, but things go horribly wrong. Although Joe had performed this trick before using a wooden coffin and dirt, this time he upped the ante, using a glass coffin and covering it with cement. The idea being that he must escape the coffin before the cement dries. Unfortunately, he never actually calculated the weight of the cement against the structural integrity of the glass coffin, and as they were covering the coffin, it collapsed, crushing Joe inside. The Flaming Arrow Stunt. More of a sideshow than a magic act, Ryan Stock and Anne Boleyn were a duo who performed on America's Got Talent in 2016. Their acts usually consisted of dangerous stunts, but they're probably most well known for a major mishap during their quarterfinal performance. The act was meant to end with Ryan swallowing a sword with a bullseye at the end of it and Anne Boleyn firing a flaming arrow into the bullseye. However, the arrow missed the mark, striking Ryan in the shoulder, somehow not stabbing him. What's disturbing about this is the fact that he has a freaking sword in his throat while this happens. He somehow managed to come out unscathed, but the two didn't make it to the semifinals. David Blain bullet catch. There are 2 notable times that David Blain performed the infamous bullet catch stunt. Once, he had his best friend fire the bullet, and again when he fired the gun himself using a string around the trigger. Before we get into the incident where he injured his throat doing this, it's worth noting that David Blain is actually performing a different kind of bullet catch. The original bullet catch trick is exactly that, a trick. There's various ways to do this, but it usually involves an audience member signing the bullet and the performers using sleight of hand to acquire it while loading a blank into a gun, giving the illusion that the gun is firing an actual round while the performer seems to catch it in their teeth. Now, when David David Blain performed this stunt, he claimed he was not doing an illusion of any kind and that this was 100% real. Instead of pretending to catch a bullet in his teeth, he put a metal cup in his mouth between a mouth guard and had the bullet bounce off the cup. As I said, the first time he performed this, he had his best friend fire the gun and it actually seemed to go off without a hitch. The second time he performed this trick, he decided it was wrong to put that kind of pressure on his friend and decided to fire the gun himself. Using a mirror and a laser guide, he then pulls on a string to fire the rifle. This time something does go wrong as the actual mouthpiece breaks and strikes the back of his throat. He immediately feels the back of his neck, thinking that the bullet went through his head, and the medic checks his throat saying there's a laceration. It's pretty intense to watch, I have to admit.
Alright, you okay? You good? The broke.
I'm generally skeptical when magicians claim that something is 100% real. I tend to think that David Blain does incorporate illusions into these stunts, but this one looks very real, and either way, it is pretty cool to watch. Okay, let's get into tier 2, starting with Vietnam's Got Talent acid drinking. This is probably one of the most disturbing instances to occur on any of the Got Talent shows. A young magician, Tran Tan Phat, was performing a dangerous trick involving acid. The idea is that Phat fills 4 glasses with water and 1 glass with acid. One of the judges then shuffles the 5 glasses around, and Phat must now selectively drink every glass of water, hopefully leaving the acid for last, which he'll pour on a sponge to show its effects. Unfortunately, Phat messed up and he actually drinks the acid. You can see him visually disturbed as the judges begin to wonder what's going on. To his credit, he actually finishes the trick, but it's kind of weird because he clearly drinks out of the glass with the acid, but then just puts it back down and pretends it never happened. So by the end of the trick, everyone is left concerned and confused. One of the most off-putting things about this is when the judges and audience begin laughing as the man is in severe pain. He awkwardly walks off stage and goes to the hospital. He suffered burns on his lips and tongue, but luckily the damage wasn't too bad and he was able to recover in just a few weeks. Vivian Hensley. This is a famous story from the early 30s and is one of the few incidents here that's not concerning a professional magician. Dr. Vivian Hensley, a dentist, practiced magic as a hobby, with his best trick involving him swallowing a rusty razor blade. Obviously this was simply an illusion, but one night while performing in front of his children, he slipped up and actually threw the rusty blade down his throat. Despite several emergency surgeries, he died after 4 days. In my opinion, this is one of the most cringy on the list. I can't even think about it without wincing. This Morning knife throwing incident. This incident occurred in 2003 when circus performer Jade Hansen came on the UK morning show This Morning to perform his knife throwing act with his assistant and girlfriend Yana Rodionova. Well, despite being a pretty skilled knife thrower, Hansen slips up and strikes Yana on the top of her head. She seems instantly disturbed, and as one of the hosts gets a look at her, she screams.
She does have a cut.
It's hard to tell how much damage this actually did, but if you look really closely, you can see a trickle of blood dripping down the side of her face. What's most strange about this is the way the male host just wraps up the segment as if there isn't a woman bleeding from the head behind him. A lot of people criticize him for that, saying he has zero compassion, but on the other hand, I think he handled it fairly professionally, quickly ending the segment and taking the attention off of the girl. What do you think?
She's got a cut. She does have a cut, but do we know how many that was?
The Great Lafayette. The Great Lafayette, whose real name was Sigmund Neuberger, died in 1911 in the middle of an act. While performing his opening trick, The Lion's Bride, a fire broke out on stage. Lafayette managed to escape the flames initially, but ran back into the burning building to save his horse, ultimately leading to his death. An interesting detail here is that what they thought was Lafayette's body originally turned out to be his body double, and they found his actual body several days later. Details like this have led to a few conspiracies, like Lafayette faking his own death. Spencer Horseman. Spencer Horseman is a magician and escape artist whose most well-known escape involves him hanging in a glass tank and being chained up with over a dozen padlocks. He has to pick all the locks, open the top of the tank where he'll attach a safety line to himself. That's because after 2 minutes, the tank will release from the bottom. So if Spencer doesn't drown in his attempt to do all of this, he'll fall presumably to his death. While he successfully performed this stunt on America's Got Talent, he's actually passed out 4 4 times attempting it in the past. 2 times this was caught on video. Once during a performance on Nightline, he lost consciousness in front of a live crowd. Luckily, his crew reacted quickly and got him out before he died. Another time this happened was while rehearsing for Criss Angel's The Supernaturalist show in Vegas, where Spencer passed out. It just so happens that this rehearsal was filmed, and we can actually see the crew fighting desperately to save him, including Criss Angel himself, who straight up parkour climbs the damn thing and yanks the metal rods out. I actually have to give props to Criss Angel. People give him a lot of shit, but that's pretty badass. Well, once again, Spencer got lucky and survived without serious injury. It's kind of shocking to me that the guy doesn't have brain damage at this point. There's actually a video of Criss Angel giving him a hard time in his hospital room, which is kind of funny.
4 times you fucking pass out. Did you 4 times?
The NBA halftime show drowning. In 2009, during a halftime show at an OKC Thunder game, escape artist Kristen Johnson was performing the classic water torture cell escape in front of thousands of people when things took a bad turn. Johnson loses consciousness and the team is very slow to get her out of the tank. When this clip was first uploaded onto the internet, at the time the ending was typically cut out and it was usually stated that Kristen Johnson actually drowned, dying in front of all those people. In reality, she did survive and even performed the escape successfully the next week. It's still a really disturbing video as you see her body go limp in the tank, and it's almost infuriating how long it takes the crew to get her out. It's mostly just one guy frantically trying to open it while everyone else just stands around looking confused. What disturbs me most about this video is the random boos and heckles from the crowd, as well as a guy straight up laughing when she clearly passes out. I mean, what the hell is wrong with that guy? Okay, we're on to tier 3, starting with Tommy Cooper dies on stage. Tommy Cooper was a Welsh comedian and magician who actually died while performing on live television. His assistant comes out to adorn him in a mystical looking robe when he suddenly collapses to the floor, suffering a major heart attack. The eerie thing about this is that the crowd continues to laugh hysterically, assuming that this is all part of the act, while Cooper lays dying before their very eyes. Balabrega. Johan Möller, aka Balabrega, was a Swedish magician that became prominent in the late 1800s. Unfortunately, in the height of his career, Balabrega was killed on stage by an exploding stage light. The Houchin Incident. There isn't really a trick going wrong here, but rather a magician basically being assaulted on live television. In 2012, Houchin, a skilled magician, went on the Dominican television show Approach the Stars. During an interview segment, one of the hosts randomly rubs a flammable cologne on Houchin's head, which sets fire. Apparently this cologne is used in religious rituals, and the host said he was blessing him. In the video, you can see Houchin immediately go into panic as his head and face ignite in flames. They managed to put the fire out, but Houchin suffered severe burns. It's a pretty shocking video, and even though this happened over a decade ago, I still don't understand what the host was doing. It seems like maybe it was a prank to pour the liquid on him, but I'm not sure why it caught fire unless the host did it himself, as if he thought somehow because the guy was a magician, he could just endure the flames or something. It's really bizarre. Well, luckily Houchin recovered from the incident and the host was charged with assault. Spain's Got Talent contestant almost drowns. This is one of the most unsettling to me. A Spain's Got Talent contestant attempts a Houdini-style underwater escape. The man is locked in a straitjacket which he must escape from before unlocking the tank itself. It goes horribly wrong as the man begins to drown. Luckily, he gets his head out of the tank, but it's clear his body is in shock and there is something really off-putting about it. Don't worry though, the guy turned out alright. The Great Moodini. Michael Mooney, aka the Great Moodini, is a magician and escape artist who is unfortunately most well known for a viral clip in which he fails a deadly escape. He is handcuffed and attached to a race car and is meant to escape the cuffs before the car drags him down the track. As you might have guessed, it does just that, yanking him several yards and breaking multiple bones. Apparently he got one cuff off, but not the second. Luckily, the second one broke off or he'd likely be dead. That's pretty much it for this one. He did end up on Tosh.0 a few years back for Tosh's web redemption segment. David Copperfield lawsuit. This is kind of a weird one. It doesn't involve anyone dying or even a trick going horribly wrong. And when else am I going to talk about this? During a David Copperfield magic show at the MGM in Las Vegas, a volunteer from the audience slipped and fell. Later, the man decided to sue David Copperfield, MGM, and everyone involved, claiming claiming he got brain damage from the fall. Basically, Copperfield was doing a trick that involved a group of audience members vanishing on stage. So this is when Gavin Cox, one of the audience members, was supposedly injured. What's interesting about this whole thing is that in order to defend his case, Copperfield was forced to reveal how the trick was done. It's nothing too special. Basically, the audience members are led through a secret passage, backstage, into a different part of the room. But it's still pretty nutty that he was forced to explain the whole thing just because someone was suing him. By the way, Copperfield was not found responsible for the injury because really the guy just tripped of his own accord. Princess Tenko sword incident. Princess Tenko is a pop singer turned magician who became somewhat of a cultural phenomenon in the 80s and 90s to both Japanese and American audiences. She even got a fantasy cartoon series called Tenko and the Guardians of the Magic. Well, in 2007, while performing a trick called the Spikes of Death, she was almost spiked to death. The idea is that Tenko enters the box, which is then stabbed by 20 knives, only to re-emerge completely safe. Only this time it didn't quite work out that way. Due to a mechanical failure, the knives actually did fall on Tenko, breaking her ribs and cutting her. Apparently she was only an inch away from losing an eye as well. Luckily she managed to fully recover and is still kicking today. Magician cuts his wife's head off. I should say right off the bat that this one is highly debated on whether it's real or fake, but I'll get to that in a minute. The video started circulating around the internet around 2011. It features a magician performing the classic saw a woman in half trick on his assistant. It seems to be going normally, but once the magician brings out the chainsaw, you can see the woman freaking out with her head and arm violently thrashing in panic. Of course, this all seems like part of the show until the magician lowers the chainsaw and we see her movements stop immediately as blood begins pouring out of her covered mouth. When the magician finally realizes something isn't right, they open the box and he stands in shock, seemingly having just killed his own wife. Pretty freaky. Now, as I said, many people have suspected this to be fake. Despite how real the video comes off, there's a couple of strange details. First of all, there's a documentary style voiceover throughout the video that makes it seem like this was part of a Mondo film like Faces of Death or something like that.
When it came to the separation of the head, the assistant's head got stuck in the magic box.
But no one has ever identified any film featuring this clip. Secondly, at the end of the video, there is an advertisement for a website making the whole thing feel like viral marketing. Thirdly, there's no report of this incident happening anywhere, and if a magician really did kill his assistant/wife in front of an audience on video, it would likely be all over the news. And finally, many people who know a lot about magic have said that this doesn't really seem possible because of how the trick is actually done. Now, I'm no magic expert, so I can't speak to the last bit, but all in all, I'm inclined to believe the video is fake, especially since this thing has been scrutinized by the internet for over a decade and we've never uncovered a real story. Okay, let's get into tier 4, starting with Lithuanian knife throwing fail. Another knife act gone wrong, this time on Lithuania's Got Talent. Unfortunately, the knife thrower wasn't at his best, to say the least. He doesn't just make one mistake, he makes repeated blunders throughout this performance, including actually injuring and almost killing his assistant. In one part of the act, his assistant holds up oversized playing cards for the knife thrower to pin to the wall. Well, one knife gets way too close to the assistant's hand, slicing his finger. He's pretty professional about it and quickly hides his finger to conceal the blood. The thrower then does almost the same thing to his other hand, and at this point you can see the assistant getting visibly annoyed. To top it all off, they place a watermelon above the assistant's head, and you could probably guess this, but the guy doesn't hit it once with the knives, and in fact he throws one knife about as close as you can to the assistant's head without piercing him. At this point the assistant just walks off the board with his hand up, prematurely ending the act. By the way, he's still hiding the bloody finger behind him, and if you watch further into the video, there's actually a part where the knife thrower looks down like he notices something on the ground, and I think what's happening is he's noticing blood that's dripping from the guy's finger. It's really weird. He uses his foot to like push it away. Anyway, I imagine that the assistant was pretty pissed and had some choice words with the knife thrower after this. Dean Gunnarson underwater coffin. In another spin on the buried alive gimmick, Dean Gunnarson, an escape artist, was put into a coffin and completely submerged underwater. This event was done on Halloween 1983 with over 10,000 spectators. Well, Gunnarson unfortunately didn't emerge, and after almost 4 minutes he was pulled out of the water. He was technically dead when they got him out and onto a stretcher, but was brought back to life by paramedics in the ambulance. Anadela. Anadela was a famous Mexican soap opera star and escape artist, interesting combo, who was caught on fire when a trick went wrong on TV. She was chained from head to toe, wrapped in a bag, and placed in a locked box. The box was timed to explode after only a minute. Well, Anadela managed to make it out, but only barely, as the box exploded with her right on the edge of the explosion. She's instantly covered in flames and screams bloody murder before her crew puts the flames out. Most of the damage here was done to her hands, and she apparently needed several skin grafts. Chanchal Chanchal Lahiri. Chanchal Lahiri was an Indian magician and escape artist who unfortunately drowned during a Houdini-inspired escape attempt in 2019. It was actually kind of a unique version of the classic water escape. He's chained up with 6 padlocks, but instead of being in a tank, he was tied to a boat and was submerged while the boat dragged him underwater. I imagine the added force of the water would make this much harder, and it proved a difficult task for Chanchal as he drowned during the act. Chung Ling Soo, aka William Ellsworth Robinson. This is a wild one, and not even because of how the magician died. William Ellsworth Robinson was a white magician prominent in the early 1900s who developed an alternate personality for his stage act, a Chinese man named Chung Ling Soo. Apparently this all started when an agent was looking for a Chinese magician to perform at the Folies Bergère in Paris, as Eastern magic acts were becoming a popular gimmick at the time. So Robinson dressed up like a Chinese man wearing traditional Chinese attire, shaving his facial hair, and even applying grease paint to his skin to darken it. Yikes. Well, the show was a big hit, and after this, Robinson permanently adopted the character of Chung Ling Soo on stage and in public life, including turning his white assistant, Olive Plath, into Soo Wee Seen, dressing her up to look Chinese as well, and even presenting in public as a married Chinese couple. It's absolutely bizarre, and there are a lot of other weird details as well, but we don't have all day, so let's get to Robinson's eventual death. While performing as Chung Ling Soo in London, Robinson's version of the classic bullet catch trick went awry. Apparently, some of the gunpowder in the gun's chamber accidentally ignited and fired the bullet, which was loaded only for the show. It pierced Robinson's lung, and for the first time in public, he broke character, speaking in his normal voice in front of the crowd as he shouted, "Oh my God, something's happened, lower the curtain." He ended up dying the next day in the hospital. Pretty crazy story, and I don't know if they could get away with it these days, but I think this would make a fantastic biopic. Clown sets a dove on fire. In 2014, a video started making the rounds of a clown performing magic at a children's birthday party. In one stunt that goes horribly wrong, the clown lights a black piece of fabric on fire and then pulls a dove out of it. The problem is the bird comes out completely engulfed in flames. The clown drops the cloth as well, and it looks like he may have burned his hand, making me think that the flames spread further than they were meant to. It's a pretty disturbing video as you basically see this bird burn to death, and it's all the worse that this is at a children's party as you can hear the kids screaming and crying in the background. Okay, we're moving into the final tier, tier 5, starting with street performer knife fail. This is kind of an obscure one. It's a low quality video of a street performer who gets a pretty serious injury when a knife throwing trick goes wrong. We don't have the full context of the act, but it seems the man has brought a girl from the crowd in to help perform the trick. As I mentioned before, this is pretty ethically questionable in the world of magic to perform an actually dangerous trick with an audience member. But anyway, the girl first throws a torch and the man catches it. Pretty simple. Next, the performer has the girl throw a large knife at him, which, like the torch, he is presumably meant to catch without harming himself. Well, this doesn't go as planned, and he grabs the blade end of the knife, which seems to slice his hand open. He immediately ends the show, and you can tell that the blood is beginning to pool in his hand. I feel a little bad for the guy, mostly because there's a few crowd members that actually boo him, even though he's obviously injured. But mostly I feel bad for the girl because she must feel terrible and awkward, even though she didn't do anything wrong.
Ay, 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 ay. Ha 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 ha. Guys, this was this show. Ah.
Hannibal Hellmurto Sword Swallow. Hannibal Hellmurto is one of the featured acts in Circus of Horrors, a horror-themed show full of disturbing circus acts. Hellmurto's most notable skill is sword swallowing, where he's even swallowed multiple swords at once, but his most dangerous act is swallowing a glowing neon glass tube. If the act goes wrong, it could electrocute him or leave broken glass inside of his body. Well, on one occasion, he was seriously injured. Luckily, the glass didn't break, but while performing this act, he did manage to put a 4-inch hole in his esophagus. And only a few years earlier, he managed to pierce himself while swallowing a regular sword. Antony Britton. Antony Britton is a UK escape artist who nearly died burying himself alive. The weird thing about this one is that it's kind of a low budget version of this trick. There's no coffin, and the guy just lays down as they cover him in dirt, which I don't think I've ever seen before. Anyway, I don't know what they expected to happen, but after a certain amount of time, they have to dig him out and resuscitate him. The most common question I see regarding this one is, Why would you do this? Drummond Money-Coutts golf cart injury. So Drummond Money-Coutts, or DMC, is a British magician who actually had his own Netflix show in 2018 called Death by Magic. But long before that, in 2012, DMC suffered a major injury while performing an escape stunt involving 2 golf carts. The idea being that he was handcuffed to the carts by 100 feet of rope, meaning he must escape before being pulled apart. He did manage to get out of one set of cuffs, but unfortunately was too slow and never made it out of the second set. So he was then dragged across the ground getting severe cuts and bruises. Magician stabs himself through hand. Sorry guys, but I have no context for this one other than the clip itself. It seems to be a magician on a Mexican TV show performing the classic knife in a bag trick. Well, this is the second time this trick has gone bad on this iceberg. At least this time it's the magician himself who gets injured, but it's pretty bad. Unlike on Question for Breakfast, this knife is really sharp and does some damage. The magician gets down to the last 2 bags and chooses the wrong one. The knife goes straight through his hand and out the other side. What's really crazy here is his underwhelming reaction. You'd think he'd scream in pain, but instead he plays it off with a smile. Kind of insane. Like I said, it's hard to find the full context on this one, so I'm not sure what happened after this or whether he had long-term damage in his hand. Ted Kwan sword balance. This is a really obscure one and more funny than anything. I can't really find any background information on it, but judging by the outfits, I'm guessing this is late 70s, early 80s. It features a magician, Ted Kwan, attempting to balance a woman on the tips of 3 swords. Well, it goes bad and she slides off. In the video, it literally looks like one of them goes up her ass, but I guess it just went between her legs because they don't act too disturbed and instead everyone's laughing. Scott Wolf face fire. This one is really obscure. Portland magician Scott Wolf was performing the classic fire breathing routine. You've probably seen it at one point or another in your life. As he crosses the 2 torches and begins to blow fire into the air, the flammable liquid pours out onto his face and it goes up in flames. You can immediately hear a woman, maybe his wife or girlfriend, scream in terror from the crowd, and like a lot of these incidents, there's a bit of an awkward shuffle on stage as no one seems to know what to do. Finally, the video ends with someone yelling to call an ambulance. This video is pretty scary, mostly because every time I see this trick, I always imagine that this exact thing could easily happen, and to see my fears realized is a little disturbing. The Tonight Show Lost Media Incident. This one is fascinating. While I was researching this iceberg, I came across a strange case involving Jay Leno injuring a woman on The Tonight Show during a magic act. I fell down this rabbit hole after finding a post in the Lost Media subreddit by user Bain Returns. They did a great job compiling a ton of clues about this particular Tonight Show episode. As most things do, it all starts with a 4chan post where someone details a strange part of an episode of The Tonight Show from the early 2000s where Jay Leno performed a saw a lady in half trick. But supposedly when he started cutting, the woman cries in pain and it quickly cuts to commercial. When it returned from the commercial break, this incident was never mentioned again the rest of the show. Several other people came out of the woodwork saying they saw the episode as well and thought they had just imagined it. So at first glance, it just seems like a fake story or the start of a creepypasta or something. But upon further investigation, I'm convinced this was a real episode and that this did in fact happen despite not having any footage of the actual show. So here's what we know. The episode seems to have aired June 21st, 2001, although it apparently showed up as a rerun at least once later that year. We know this because of an archived Google conversation discussing the rerun. We also know that the episode was filmed with limited lighting, giving it a candlelight look. This was due to rolling blackouts in LA at the time. Although Leno only did this as an act of solidarity, and they weren't actually lacking any lights during the filming. Arsenio Hall was the guest for the episode, and from what I can tell from the discussions around the episode, it's actually Arsenio that's performing the trick and not Leno. Apparently, Arsenio looked legitimately shocked when the girl reacted in pain, and it fades to black almost immediately. Some people also said that the commercial break was over 10 minutes long, which is rather unusual. Obviously the show isn't live, but people seem to imply it's a heavy amount of filler and that if the segment hadn't gone awry, it would have gone on several more minutes. So I don't know how I accidentally stumbled upon this lost media case, but it would be fascinating to see this episode. If anything, to see if it was as disturbing as some people claim. I'm personally in the camp that this was most likely a joke, although there are good arguments either way, and it's hard to tell until we somehow get a hold of the actual segment. I know this entry is veered a bit outside of the core of the iceberg, but let me know if you find it interesting because I've thought about doing an iceberg concerning late night talk show incidents. Well, there you have it. I hope you find this iceberg as interesting as I did. It's nice to step outside some of the usual topics I cover and learn more about a particular subject. Let me know if there are any incidents I missed, or if you want to see a larger iceberg on the topic. I actually think I covered most magic related incidents here, but I could definitely see a more expansive iceberg on stunts of any kind, so that might be worth digging into. I want to thank my friends on Patreon, Naomi Romero, Soma, Krusty the Crab, One Group, Laz Wishgender, Glimmering Haster, Hunter Piva, Heather M, Creepypasta Cube, A Slightly Bigger Ant, Ricky Shadow, Chase Middleton, Strong Kohi, Matt Rozak, Glenn Bridges, Steamboat Millie, The Beast Llama, and Holy Ears. You guys are awesome. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. If you want a shout out like that at the end of every episode, as well as bonus content, consider becoming a patron. The link's below, but I appreciate you guys watching at all, so thank you. This is Grief speaking. Goodbye, friends.